The morning sun cast long shadows across the obstacle course at Fort Henderson, when Sergeant Marcus Kane decided to make an example of someone he considered the weakest link in his unit. What he didn't know was that he was about to humiliate one of the most lethal soldiers the U.S. Army had ever produced, someone whose weak arm had once single-handedly changed the outcome of a classified operation that saved an entire battalion. The armored vehicle training ground buzzed with the usual pre-dawn activity as Alpha Company prepared for their monthly combat readiness assessment. Soldiers checked equipment, reviewed tactical procedures, and mentally prepared for the grueling day ahead. Among them stood Private First Class Kayla Martinez, quietly adjusting her gear while trying to remain invisible in the crowd of much larger, more imposing soldiers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At barely 5'4" inches and weighing 125 pounds soaking wet, Kayla looked like she'd been assigned to the wrong unit by mistake. Her slight frame seemed almost comical next to the towering figures of her male counterparts, each one built like a linebacker and twice her size. But it wasn't her size that drew unwanted attention. It was her left arm. The limb hung at a slightly awkward angle, the result of what appeared to be old injuries that had healed improperly. When she moved, there was a subtle stiffness to her shoulder, a barely perceptible limitation in her range of motion that trained military eyes could spot immediately. To her fellow soldiers, it was a weakness. To Sergeant Kane, it was an embarrassment to his unit's reputation. Martinez. Kane's voice cracked like a whip across the training ground, causing every head to turn in her direction. The burly sergeant approached with the swagger of a man who'd built his career on breaking down soldiers he deemed unfit for service. Behind him followed his usual entourage of supporters, soldiers who'd learned that agreeing with Kane's assessments was the path of least resistance. Kayla snapped to attention, her spine straight despite the obvious discomfort it caused her left shoulder. She'd been dreading this moment for weeks, knowing that Kane had been looking for an excuse to single her out in front of the entire company. Her service record might be spotless, but her physical limitations made her an easy target. For someone who measured military worth purely in terms of brute strength. "Tell me, Martinez," Kane began, circling her like a predator sizing up wounded prey, "how exactly do you expect to handle heavy weapons with that gimp arm of yours?" His voice carried across the training ground, ensuring that every soldier within 100 yards could hear the humiliation being delivered. The question hung in the air like a challenge, but Kayla remained silent. She'd learned long ago that responding to such provocations only made things worse. Instead, she focused on a point somewhere beyond Kane's shoulder, her breathing steady and controlled despite the rage building in her chest. Kane wasn't finished. He gestured toward the Javelin anti-tank missiles arranged on nearby weapon racks, their sleek forms gleaming in the morning sunlight. "These beauties weigh 49 pounds fully loaded," he announced to his audience. "Require perfect balance, precise aim, and the kind of upper body strength that comes from real military training, not whatever diversity program brought you here." Nervous laughter rippled through the assembled soldiers, though many looked uncomfortable with the public nature of Kane's attack. Still, nobody spoke up. Kane had a reputation for destroying the careers of soldiers who crossed him, and self-preservation trumped solidarity in his unit. "I want you to demonstrate proper javelin handling for the company," Kane continued, his smile revealing teeth yellowed by years of chewing tobacco. "Show us all how someone with your limitations handles a real weapon system." Kayla's fingers unconsciously moved to touch something beneath her uniform, a small metal object that hung on a chain around her neck. The gesture was so brief that most observers missed it entirely, but it seemed to steady her somehow, providing an anchor of calm in the storm of humiliation being directed her way. She moved toward the weapon rack with measured steps, her gait slightly favoring her right. sighed. The Javelin missile system loomed before her, its sophisticated targeting computer and launch mechanism representing the pinnacle of modern anti-tank warfare technology. To most soldiers, it was an intimidating piece of equipment that required extensive training to master. To Kane, it was the perfect tool to demonstrate Kayla's inadequacy. "Go ahead," Kane taunted, his voice dripping with false encouragement. "Let's see that textbook form they must have taught you in basic training." Kayla lifted the weapon system, and immediately the weight seemed to overwhelm her slight frame. Her left arm trembled visibly under the load, the old injury clearly limiting her ability to maintain proper positioning. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she struggled to achieve the correct stance, her breathing becoming labored with the effort. The assembled soldiers watched in uncomfortable silence as she fumbled with the targeting system, her movements clumsy and uncertain. Kane's supporters began to snicker, their amusement growing as Kayla's difficulties became more apparent. The weapon wavered in her grasp, threatening to slip from her weakened grip at any moment. "That's enough," Kane declared, his voice heavy with manufactured disappointment. "Martinez, you're a danger to yourself and everyone around you with that equipment. I'm recommending immediate transfer to supply logistics where your ... condition ... won't endanger real soldiers." But as Kane delivered his verdict, something unexpected happened. From the observation area where senior officers typically watched training exercises, a figure stepped forward from the shadows. Colonel Sarah Chun, the base's deputy commander, had been quietly observing the morning's activities when Kane's performance caught her attention. Chun was a decorated combat veteran, whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for abuse of authority. She'd served 3 tours in active combat zones, and had little patience for leaders who confused cruelty with strength. What she'd just witnessed made her blood boil with a cold fury that Kane was about to experience firsthand. "Sergeant Kane." Chun's voice cut through the morning air with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The entire training ground fell silent as soldiers recognized the voice of someone who could end careers with a single word. Kane turned, his expression shifting from smug satisfaction to barely concealed panic as he realized they'd had an audience for his theatrical humiliation of Martinez. He snapped to attention, his mind racing through the implications of having a senior officer witness his actions. "Colonel Chun, ma'am," he stammered, trying to salvage the situation. "I was just conducting routine weapons proficiency training. Martinez here was demonstrating proper..." "What I saw," Chun interrupted, her tone as cold as Arctic wind, "was a senior NCO publicly humiliating a soldier based on what appears to be a service-connected disability. Would you care to explain the military value of that particular training exercise?" The question hit Kane like a physical blow. Around him, soldiers who had been laughing moments before now studied their boots with sudden intensity, recognizing that the dynamic had shifted dramatically. Kayla remained at attention, still holding the Javelin system despite the obvious strain it caused her. Chun approached the group with the measured pace of someone conducting an inspection, her eyes never leaving Kane's increasingly pale face. "Furthermore, Sergeant, I'm curious about your assessment of Martinez's capabilities. Have you reviewed her complete service record? Her training scores? Her deployment history?" Kane's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The truth was, he'd never bothered to look beyond the obvious physical limitations that made Kayla an easy target. To him, she was simply a weak link to be eliminated, not a soldier whose background might tell a different story. "I thought not," Chun continued, her voice carrying the weight of disappointed authority. "Martinez, you're dismissed from this exercise. Report to my office at 1400 hours for a private discussion." As Kayla carefully returned the Javelin system to its rack and departed the training ground, Chun turned her attention back to Kane. "What?" she said next was delivered in a voice low enough that only he could hear. But the color that drained from his face suggested it wasn't a conversation he was enjoying. The other soldiers began to disperse, their morning training taking on a subdued tone as word of the confrontation spread through the unit. Some watched Kayla's retreating figure with new curiosity, wondering what secrets her service record might contain. Others focused on Kane, whose confident demeanor had evaporated like morning mist under Chun's withering assessment. What none of them knew was that Kayla Martinez carried more than just the weight of an old injury. The metal object she'd touched during her humiliation wasn't a religious symbol or good luck charm. It was a piece of shrapnel from an enemy tank that had been destroyed by her own hand in a classified operation that would never appear in official records. The weak arm that Kane had mocked so publicly had once launched a Javelin missile with such precision that it had eliminated an advancing enemy armor column, saving hundreds of American lives in the process. But that was a story buried in classified files, protected by security clearances that few possessed and fewer still would ever see. As the morning sun climbed higher over Fort Henderson, casting harsh light on the training ground where Kayla's humiliation had played out, the stage was set for a reckoning that would reveal the true cost of judging soldiers by their apparent limitations rather than their proven capabilities. Kane had chosen his target poorly, and the consequences would reshape everything he thought he knew about strength, weakness, and the price of underestimating those who serve in silence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 miles from Fort Henderson, in a modest duplex on Oakwood Drive, Kayla Martinez lived a life of carefully constructed routine that few would recognize as belonging to one of the military's most classified assets. The small 2-bedroom unit was spartanly furnished, but every detail revealed the occupant's military precision and her desperate need to maintain control over an environment that had once been anything but controllable. The morning alarm sounded at exactly 0500 hours, though Kayla had been awake for the past 20 minutes, staring at the ceiling and fighting off the remnants of dreams that weren't quite nightmares, but weren't peaceful either. Her left arm ached with the familiar throb that had become her constant companion since the incident 3 years ago. A reminder of the day everything changed. She moved through her morning routine with mechanical precision. Black coffee, no sugar, consumed while standing at the kitchen counter, where she could see both the front door and the window overlooking the street. Old habits from forward operating bases where situational awareness meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. The bathroom mirror reflected a face that looked younger than her 26 years, but her eyes held the weight of someone who'd seen too much. Kayla carefully removed the chain from around her neck, revealing the small piece of twisted metal that hung from it, a fragment of enemy armor that most people would mistake for abstract jewelry. She never showered with it on, but she never let it leave her sight either. The injury to her left arm told a story that began in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, in a place that didn't officially exist on any map. Operation Ghost Valley had been a Black Ops mission, the kind that would never appear in history books or medal ceremonies. Kayla had been assigned as the designated marksman for a 6-person reconnaissance team tasked with eliminating a high-value target who'd been coordinating attacks on American supply convoys. What intelligence hadn't told them was that their target had recently acquired a shipment of Russian T-72 tanks, turning what should have been a surgical strike into a desperate fight for survival against overwhelming armor superiority. The mission had gone sideways in the worst possible way, with Kayla's team pinned down in a narrow valley, while enemy tanks closed in from multiple directions. She still remembered the weight of the Javelin system in her hands that day, the way her training had taken over when conscious thought became impossible. The first tank had been advancing on their position when she'd fired, the missile streaking across the valley to punch through the vehicle's armor like it was made of paper. The explosion had lit up the mountainside, but there were still 3 more tanks bearing down on their position. The second shot had been more difficult, fired while under direct machine gun fire from infantry advancing with the armor. Shrapnel from an incoming round had torn through her left shoulder, sending waves of agony down her arm and making it nearly impossible to maintain proper weapon positioning. But she'd held steady, compensating for the injury through sheer force of will, and sent another missile into the side of the advancing T-72. By the third shot, her arm was barely functional, blood streaming down from multiple wounds. Her spotter, Sergeant Danny Rodriguez from El Paso, had been trying to help her maintain the weapon's position while coordinating with their extraction team. The last tank had been the closest, less than 200 meters away, and closing fast, its main gun swiveling toward their position. Kayla had closed her eyes, steadied her breathing, and fired blind, trusting muscle memory and thousands of hours of training to guide the missile home. The explosion had been so close that debris from the destroyed tank had rained down on their position, including the piece of twisted metal that now hung around her neck, a reminder of the moment when her weakness had saved 6 American lives and eliminated an entire enemy armor column. The medical evacuation had been a blur of helicopters and field hospitals, but what she remembered most clearly was waking up in a hospital in Germany to find a lieutenant colonel sitting beside her bed. He'd introduced himself as Tom Bradley from a unit that doesn't officially exist, and what he'd told her had changed everything. Operation Ghost Valley was being classified at the highest levels, he'd explained. The mission had never happened. Her team had never been there, and the destroyed tanks would be attributed to an airstrike that had conveniently occurred at the same time. Her actions would never be officially recognized, her heroism would never be celebrated, and her sacrifice would be buried in files that most people would never have clearance to see. Why? She'd asked, her voice hoarse from the medications they'd been pumping into her system. Bradley's answer had been delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd had this conversation before. Because, Martinez, some victories are too sensitive to acknowledge. Because the world isn't ready to know that a single soldier with a damaged arm took out 3 tanks in conditions that would break most people. Because sometimes the greatest service we can provide is to let others sleep peacefully at night, never knowing how close they came to losing everything. The recovery had been long and painful, both physically and emotionally. Military surgeons had done their best to repair the damage to her shoulder, but the complex fractures and nerve damage had left her with permanent limitations. She could function, could perform most military duties, but the precision and strength that had once made her legendary were forever compromised. More challenging than the physical rehabilitation had been the psychological adjustment to anonymity. For 3 years before the mission, Kayla had been building a reputation as one of the most accurate anti-tank specialists in the Army. Her training scores had been off the charts. Her performance in exercises had drawn attention from special operations units, and her future had seemed limitless. Yet now she was just another soldier with a service-connected injury, transferred to routine duties and expected to blend into the background. The Army had given her a choice: medical retirement with full benefits, or continued service in a capacity that matched her current physical limitations. She'd chosen to stay, unable to imagine life outside the uniform that had defined her since she was 18. The transition to Fort Henderson had been presented as a fresh start, an opportunity to contribute to training the next generation of soldiers. What it really meant was a slow fade into obscurity, surrounded by people who saw only her limitations and never suspected what she'd once been capable of accomplishing. Her apartment reflected this new reality in ways both subtle and obvious. The closet contained uniforms bearing the standard ribbons of a career soldier: National Defense Service Medal, Army Service Ribbon, Overseas Service Ribbon. Nothing that would suggest she'd ever seen combat, let alone change the outcome of a classified operation. The only hint of her true background was a locked footlocker beneath her bed, containing gear and memories from a time when she'd been someone else entirely. Late at night, when the pain in her arm made sleep impossible, Kayla would sometimes open that footlocker and run her fingers over the equipment inside. Range cards covered with her precise handwriting, documenting wind speeds and target distances from training exercises that had prepared her for missions that officially never happened. Photographs of her old team, 6 faces that would never age beyond the moment captured by the camera. The psychological evaluation reports, hidden at the bottom of the footlocker, told a different story than the one she presented to the world. They spoke of survivor's guilt, of a soldier who'd saved her entire team, but couldn't stop replaying the moment when Rodriguez had been wounded by shrapnel meant for her. They documented night terrors that left her gasping and reaching for weapons that weren't there, and a hypervigilance that made normal social interaction nearly impossible. But they also documented something else, an unshakable commitment to service, a determination to continue contributing even when the contributions would never be acknowledged. The psychologists had noted her remarkable resilience, her ability to compartmentalize trauma, while maintaining her core identity as a soldier and protector. As Kayla prepared for another day of humiliation and mockery at Fort Henderson, she touched the piece of shrapnel hanging around her neck and made the same promise she'd made every morning for the past year. She would endure whatever Kane and others like him threw at her, because enduring was what she did. She would absorb their contempt and their ignorance, because somewhere in classified files, 3 destroyed tanks and 6 saved lives proved that strength couldn't be measured by appearance or physical limitation. What she didn't know was that Colonel Chun had spent the previous evening reviewing those same classified files, her security clearance providing access to truths that would soon reshape everything Kane thought he knew about the soldier he'd chosen to torment. The meeting in Colonel Chun's office at 1400 hours would have to wait. By noon, Sergeant Kane had already launched the next phase of his campaign against Kayla Martinez, this time with the calculated precision of someone who'd made destroying careers into an art form. What had begun as public humiliation was about to evolve into systematic psychological warfare designed to force Kayla out of the military entirely. The first strike came during the lunch formation, when Kane announced new duty assignments for the week. While other soldiers received standard training rotations, Kayla found herself assigned to what Kane euphemistically called remedial physical conditioning, a series of tasks specifically designed to highlight her limitations while providing maximum entertainment for his supporters. Martinez will be demonstrating proper ammunition loading procedures, Kane announced to the assembled company, his voice carrying the false cheerfulness of someone delivering good news. Since her arm strength seems to be an ongoing concern, we'll give her plenty of opportunities to build up those muscles. The demonstration took place at the motor pool, where Kane had arranged for Kayla to single-handedly load 120mm tank rounds into an M1A2 Abrams. Each round weighed 55 pounds, and proper loading technique required lifting them from ground level to chest height while maintaining perfect balance and control. For someone with full arm strength, it was challenging but manageable. For someone with Kayla's limitations, it was designed to be impossible. Private Tommy Johnson from Nashville watched with growing discomfort as Kayla struggled with the first round, her left arm visibly shaking under the weight. Johnson had joined the Army 6 months ago and still possessed enough civilian sensibility to recognize cruelty when he saw it. But he also understood the unspoken rules of military hierarchy. Challenging a sergeant's authority was a career-limiting move that few soldiers were willing to make. The second round proved even more difficult, Kayla's breathing becoming labored as she fought to maintain proper form while her injured shoulder screamed in protest. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool October air, and her usual composure began to crack under the physical strain and public scrutiny. "Faster, Martinez," Kane called out, his tone suggesting helpful encouragement while his eyes gleamed. with sadistic pleasure. Enemy tanks won't wait for you to catch your breath. In combat, hesitation means death for everyone around you. Staff Sergeant Lisa Chun, no relation to the colonel, had been observing from the maintenance bay where she was conducting routine vehicle inspections. Chun was a 12-year veteran who'd earned her stripes through competence rather than politics. And what she was witnessing made her blood boil. She'd served with enough injured soldiers to recognize when someone was being deliberately set up for failure. As Kayla attempted to load the third round, her weakened grip finally gave way. The massive shell slipped from her hands, crashing to the concrete with a metallic clang that echoed across the motor pool. Kane's supporters erupted in laughter while Kayla stood frozen, staring down at the ammunition that had defeated her. Equipment failure, Kane announced dramatically. Caused by operator incompetence. Martinez, you've just demonstrated why soldiers with physical limitations are a danger to their units. In a real combat situation, that dropped round could have meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But as Kane delivered his verdict, Staff Sergeant Chun made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire situation. She approached the group with the bearing of someone who'd earned respect through 15 deployments and countless hours under fire. Sergeant Kane, Chun's voice cut through the laughter with the authority of someone who'd actually seen combat. I'm curious about the tactical relevance of this exercise. In my experience, tank crews load ammunition as a team, not individually. When exactly would a soldier be expected to single-handedly load main gun rounds under combat conditions? Kane turned, his expression shifting from smugness to irritation at having his performance interrupted. Staff Sergeant Chun, this is basic physical readiness training. Soldiers need to be capable of handling equipment under all circumstances. All circumstances, Chun repeated, her tone suggesting she was considering the statement carefully. So you're saying that proper military doctrine involves single soldiers manually loading tank rounds without crew assistance? Interesting. I'll have to review the field manuals to see where that's documented. The challenge was subtle but unmistakable. Chun was calling Kane's methodology into question without directly insubordinating him. A delicate balance that required both tactical intelligence and nerves of steel. Around them, soldiers began to sense the shifting dynamic as a real veteran challenged Kane's manufactured authority. Kane's face flushed red as he realized his carefully orchestrated humiliation was being undermined by someone with actual combat credibility. The exercise stands as designed, Staff Sergeant. Martinez needs to demonstrate basic physical competency if she expects to remain in this unit. I see, Chun replied, her voice remaining professionally neutral. And what's the acceptable performance standard for this particular assessment? How many rounds should she load to pass? What's the time limit? Who's the evaluating authority? I want to make sure I document this properly for the training records. The questions hit Kane like artillery rounds, each one exposing the arbitrary nature of his exercise. He hadn't established any measurable standards, because the entire point had been to ensure Kayla's failure, not to conduct legitimate training. Now he was trapped between admitting his real agenda and attempting to improvise military standards on the spot. The standard is ... Kane began, then paused as he realized he was walking into a trap. Any number he provided would need to be justified, documented, and potentially reviewed by higher authority. The standard is adequate performance for unit readiness. Adequate performance, Chun repeated. Could you define that more specifically? Because from where I'm standing, Private Martinez has successfully loaded 2 rounds and attempted a third. In my experience, tank crews typically work in teams of 4, with each member handling specific components of the loading sequence. So I'm having trouble understanding what military standard we're applying here. The verbal fencing match was drawing attention from across the motor pool, as other soldiers recognized they were witnessing something more significant than routine training. Word began to spread through the usual military communication channels, informal networks of NCOs and specialists who understood that something interesting was happening at the tank loading area. Kane found himself in an increasingly precarious position. Chun's questions were technically respectful and professionally phrased, but they were systematically dismantling the facade of legitimacy he'd tried to construct around his harassment campaign. He could either admit that the exercise was punitive rather than educational, or attempt to defend standards that existed nowhere in military doctrine. "Staff Sergeant Chun," Kane said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "I don't appreciate having my training methods questioned by subordinates. This exercise is designed to build character and identify soldiers who may not be suited for combat roles." "Character building," Chun nodded thoughtfully. "I can respect that, Sergeant. Character is definitely important in combat situations. Speaking of which, I'm curious about your own combat experience. How many deployments have you completed? Any direct combat exposure? Tank operations under fire?" The question landed like a physical blow. Kane's service record was a carefully guarded secret that he'd spent years ensuring nobody examined too closely. The truth was that his 22-year career had been spent entirely in training environments and administrative positions, with his closest approach to combat being a brief assignment to a logistics unit in Kuwait that had never left the secure base perimeter. "My experience is documented in my service record," Kane replied stiffly, recognizing that he was losing control of the situation, "which is not subject to public discussion in front of junior enlisted personnel." Chun smiled, the expression carrying no warmth whatsoever. "Of course, Sergeant. I understand completely. Operational security is always important. I was just wondering because some of us who have actually loaded tank rounds under enemy fire might have insights into realistic training standards. But I'm sure your methods are based on solid doctrinal foundation." The implication was clear to everyone present. Chun was calling Kane's combat credentials into question without directly stating that he was a desk soldier masquerading as a warrior. The subtle challenge sent ripples of excitement through the observing soldiers who rarely witness senior NCOs engaging in this kind of verbal combat. As tension crackled between the two sergeants, Kayla continued to stand beside the dropped ammunition round, forgotten in the larger confrontation developing around her. She understood that Chun was defending her, but she also knew that drawing this kind of attention was dangerous. In her experience, soldiers who stood out for any reason, positive or negative, often found themselves facing consequences that extended far beyond the immediate situation. What none of them knew was that Colonel Chun had been conducting her own investigation into Kane's background and methods, and that the information she'd uncovered would soon transform this confrontation from a battle between NCOs into something far more consequential for everyone involved. Meanwhile, across the base at the communications center, Master Sergeant Rodriguez was processing a routine request for personnel records that would change everything. The request had come from Colonel Chun's office, bearing the proper authorization codes and security clearances. But as Rodriguez pulled up the files, he recognized a name that made his blood run cold with recognition. Kayla Martinez. Rodriguez had been the communications specialist for Operation Ghost Valley, responsible for coordinating the extraction that had saved Kayla's team after their impossible stand against enemy armor. He'd listened to the radio chatter as she'd called in target coordinates, heard the explosions as her Javelin missiles found their marks, and witnessed the aftermath when 6 soldiers walked off a battlefield where they should have died. Now, 3 years later, he was staring at a service record that told none of that story. According to the official documents, Kayla Martinez was just another soldier with a service-connected injury, transferred to routine duties after a training accident. But Rodriguez knew better. He knew what she'd really done, and he knew that someone was finally asking the right questions. As he prepared the files for Colonel Chun's review, Rodriguez made a decision that would ultimately expose the truth. Hidden in the depths of classified databases were combat footage and mission reports that painted a very different picture of the woman Kane was trying to destroy. And now those files were about to reach someone with the authority and motivation to act on what they revealed. Back at the motor pool, the confrontation between Kane and Staff Sergeant Chen was reaching a crescendo that would force Kane into the kind of mistake that would ultimately destroy him. The trap was set, the players were in position, and the truth was finally beginning to surface from the depths of classified files and buried memories. Colonel Sarah Chun's office in the Fort Henderson headquarters building had become a war room by Thursday evening. The mahogany desk that normally held routine administrative paperwork was now covered with classified files, secure laptops displaying encrypted communications, and a growing stack of evidence that painted a picture so disturbing it made her question everything she thought she knew about her own base. The investigation had begun as a routine inquiry into potential harassment, but what Chen was uncovering suggested something far more sinister: a systematic campaign of abuse targeting soldiers who couldn't defend themselves, orchestrated by someone who had never earned the right to judge anyone's combat worthiness. Master Sergeant Rodriguez had delivered the first bombshell that afternoon, arriving at Chun's office with a manila folder marked with classification stamps that made her eyebrows rise. Rodriguez was a weathered veteran whose 28 years of service had taken him through 3 wars and countless classified operations. When he spoke, senior officers listened. "Colonel," Rodriguez had said, settling into the chair across from her desk with the careful movements of someone whose body carried the accumulated damage of decades in uniform, "I need to show you something about Private Martinez that changes everything we think we know about her." The first document he'd placed on her desk was a personnel file that bore no resemblance to the sanitized record in Kayla's official jacket. This version contained deployment dates, unit designations, and mission parameters that were still classified at levels requiring special compartmented information clearances. But it was the photographs that made Chun's breath catch in her throat. The images showed a young woman in full combat gear, her face streaked with dust and cordite residue, standing beside the smoking wreckage of what had once been a Russian T-72 tank. In the background, other destroyed vehicles dotted a mountainous landscape that Chun recognized from intelligence briefings as some of the most dangerous terrain in Afghanistan. "Operation Ghost Valley," Rodriguez explained, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been there when it happened. "July 15th, 3 years ago. Specialist Martinez and her team were tasked with eliminating a high-value target who'd been coordinating attacks on our supply convoys. Intelligence said it was a surgical strike mission. They didn't mention that the target had recently acquired a company of main battle tanks." Chun studied the photographs with the analytical eye of someone who'd spent her career evaluating military operations. The tactical situation was clear from the terrain and vehicle positioning. A small team caught in a valley with limited escape routes, facing overwhelming armor superiority. It should have been a massacre. 6-person reconnaissance team, Rodriguez continued, pulling out additional documents. Standard loadout included 2 Javelin anti-tank systems and enough ammunition to engage maybe 4 targets under ideal conditions. What they faced was 3 T-72s supported by dismounted infantry, advancing on their position from multiple directions. The after-action reports made for sobering reading. Chun found herself absorbed in accounts of radio communications that painted a picture of impossible courage under fire. Transcripts showed Kayla's voice remaining calm and steady as she called in target coordinates, while enemy machine gun fire raked their position. The first tank was advancing directly on their defensive position, Rodriguez explained, pointing to tactical diagrams that showed the enemy's approach. Range, approximately 400 meters, closing fast. Martinez engaged with her first Javelin and achieved a direct hit, penetrating the frontal armor and causing a catastrophic explosion that eliminated the immediate threat. Chun studied the technical specifications of the engagement, her military training allowing her to appreciate the precision required for such a shot. Javelin missiles were sophisticated weapons, but their effectiveness depended entirely on the operator's ability to maintain steady aim while under extreme stress. For a soldier taking direct fire, it was a nearly impossible task. The second engagement was more complex, Rodriguez continued, his voice growing quieter as he relived the memories. Enemy infantry had moved to support the remaining tanks, and shrapnel from an incoming round damaged Martinez's left shoulder. Medical reports indicate significant trauma to the joint and surrounding tissue. The medical documentation made for difficult reading. Chun found herself wincing as she reviewed field surgeon reports describing compound fractures, nerve damage, and tissue trauma that should have ended any soldier's combat effectiveness immediately. Yet the mission reports showed that Kayla had continued fighting despite injuries that would have incapacitated most people. She fired her second javelin while bleeding and under direct machine gun fire, Rodriguez said, his admiration evident despite his professional tone. Another direct hit, eliminating the second tank and buying her team the time they needed to establish a defensive perimeter for extraction. But it was the third engagement that truly revealed the measure of Kayla's character. Chun read the account twice, unable to fully comprehend what the documents were describing. With her left arm barely functional and her team pinned down by the final tank's advance, Kayla had made a decision that defied both medical possibility and tactical doctrine. The last tank was less than 200 meters away when she fired, Rodriguez explained. Closing fast, main gun traversing toward their position. She couldn't maintain proper weapon stance due to her injuries, so she improvised. Braced the javelin against a rock formation, used her good arm to stabilize the system, and fired essentially blind, trusting muscle memory and training to guide the missile home. The photograph of the third tank's destruction showed a mass of twisted metal and scattered debris. The explosion had been so violent that pieces of the vehicle had been thrown hundreds of meters from the impact site. It was the kind of devastating hit that weapons instructors used as examples of perfect javelin employment. 6 soldiers extracted alive from a situation that should have killed them all, Rodriguez concluded. 3 enemy tanks destroyed by someone who, according to her current tormentors, is too weak to handle military equipment properly. Chun leaned back in her chair, absorbing the implications of what she'd just learned. The woman Kane had been systematically humiliating wasn't just a capable soldier, she was a legitimate war hero whose actions had saved American lives under conditions that would break most people. The disconnect between Kayla's actual service record and her current treatment was so profound it bordered on the surreal. Why was this classified? Chun asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Rodriguez's expression darkened. Because Operation Ghost Valley was politically sensitive. We weren't supposed to be operating in that area, and the target we eliminated had connections to people who preferred that his death remain mysterious. The entire mission was buried in black files to avoid diplomatic complications. The colonel studied the classified documents again, noting details that painted an even more complex picture. Post-mission intelligence reports indicated that the eliminated target had been planning a major offensive against U.S. supply lines. Kayla's team hadn't just survived an impossible situation, they'd prevented what could have been a significant escalation in regional hostilities. There's more, Rodriguez said, producing another folder. I've been quietly investigating Sergeant Kane's background, and what I found explains a lot about his behavior toward Martinez. Kane's true service record made for interesting reading. 22 years of military service. But Chun noted immediately what was missing. Any significant combat deployments, special training certifications, or leadership positions that would justify his current authority over combat veterans. His closest approach to actual combat was a 6-month rotation in Kuwait, Rodriguez explained. Logistics support, never left the base perimeter. The rest of his career has been training assignments and administrative positions where his lack of real experience wouldn't be exposed. Chun began to understand the psychological dynamics at play. Kane wasn't just harassing Kayla because of her physical limitations. He was threatened by the presence of someone whose combat record highlighted his own lack of genuine military experience. By destroying her credibility, he was protecting his own carefully constructed facade of authority. He's built his entire career on intimidating people who can't fight back, Rodriguez continued. Soldiers with limited options, junior enlisted personnel who can't afford to challenge him. But he made a mistake when he targeted Martinez. He picked a fight with someone whose background, if it ever came to light, would expose him as the fraud he really is. As Chun processed this information, her secure phone rang with an encrypted call from Washington. The voice on the other end belonged to General Patricia Morrison, whose reputation for cutting through bureaucratic nonsense was legendary throughout the Army's senior leadership. "Sarah," Morrison's voice crackled through the secure connection. "I understand you've been asking questions about Operation Ghost Valley. I need to know why, and I need to know now." Chun explained the situation at Fort Henderson, describing Kane's harassment campaign and the discovery of Kayla's true background. The silence that followed her briefing stretched long enough to make her wonder if the connection had been lost. "Jesus Christ," Morrison finally said, her voice heavy with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Martinez is at Fort Henderson? Under the command of some desk jockey who's been tormenting her. Sarah, that woman saved my nephew's life. He was one of the 6 soldiers extracted from Ghost Valley." The personal connection added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. Chun realized she was dealing with something that extended far beyond routine base politics. The ripple effects of Kane's abuse were about to reach levels of command that could reshape careers and potentially trigger investigations that would embarrass the Army at the highest levels. "General," Chun said carefully, "what are my options here? Kane has been conducting what amounts to a systematic campaign of harassment against a genuine war hero, but everything he's done has been technically within his authority as her immediate supervisor." Morrison's response was delivered with the crisp authority of someone who'd spent decades navigating military politics. "Your options are simple, Sarah. You can handle this quietly and internally, or I can make some phone calls that will result in a very public investigation into how the Army treats its wounded veterans. Your choice." As Chun hung up the phone, she realized that the situation had evolved beyond damage control. The truth about Kayla Martinez was going to come out, one way or another. The only question now was whether Fort Henderson would be remembered as the place where a hero was finally recognized, or as the base where institutional failures allowed a combat veteran to be tormented by someone unworthy to shine her boots. Stage was set for a confrontation that would expose not just Kane's cruelty, but the broader failures of a system that had allowed genuine heroes to be buried while pretenders claimed authority they'd never earned. And at the center of it all was a woman whose weak arm had once saved 6 lives and destroyed 3 enemy tanks, a woman who was about to discover that some truths were too powerful to remain buried forever. The emergency meeting convened in the Fort Henderson conference room at 0600 hours. Friday morning would have seemed routine to any casual observer. Just another gathering of senior staff reviewing training schedules and personnel matters. But the tension crackling between the assembled officers told a different story, one that would determine whether justice prevailed or whether institutional corruption would claim another victim. Colonel Sarah Chun had spent the night preparing for this moment, her office becoming a strategic planning center where she'd mapped out every possible avenue of attack and defense. The evidence was overwhelming, but she knew that Kane had spent years building a network of supporters who benefited from his reign of terror. Exposing him would require surgical precision and unshakable resolve. Major David Thompson arrived. First, his weathered face betraying nothing as he took his seat at the conference table. Thompson commanded the base's military police unit, and had been quietly conducting his own investigation into multiple harassment complaints that had mysteriously disappeared before reaching higher command. His presence signaled that this wasn't just about one soldier's mistreatment, it was about systematic abuse of authority. "Major," Chun said without preamble, "what did your investigation reveal about the complaint processing system for Alpha Company?" Thompson opened a thick folder containing months of meticulous documentation. "Colonel, we found a pattern of irregularities spanning the past 2 years. 17 formal complaints filed against Sergeant Kane, ranging from harassment to abuse of authority. All 17 were either lost in processing, dismissed on technicalities, or withdrawn by complainants who cited fear of retaliation." The statistics painted a damning picture of institutional failure. Chun realized she was looking at evidence of a system that had been deliberately corrupted to protect Kane while silencing his victims. The scope of the conspiracy was broader than she'd initially understood. This wasn't just about one rogue sergeant, but about multiple failures of leadership that had allowed him to operate with impunity. "Where are those complainants now?" Chun asked, though she suspected the answer would be deeply troubling. 12 have been transferred to other bases," Thompson replied grimly. 3 received early discharge under circumstances that raise questions about coercion. 2 are still stationed here, but have been assigned to duties that limit their contact with Kane's unit. The pattern suggests a systematic effort to eliminate witnesses rather than address the underlying problems. As Chun absorbed this information, the conference room door opened to admit Staff Sergeant Lisa Chen, no relation to the colonel, whose confrontation with Kane at the motor pool had triggered the current investigation. Behind her walked a figure that made everyone in the room straighten with recognition: Command Sergeant Major Patricia Williams, whose reputation for cutting through bureaucratic corruption was legendary throughout the Army. Williams was a 30-year veteran whose combat service spanned 3 wars and countless classified operations. When she walked into a room, conversations stopped and problems got solved. Her presence at Fort Henderson meant that someone at the highest levels of command had decided Kane's reign of terror was about to end. "Gentlemen," Williams said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned every stripe through blood and sacrifice, "I've been sent here to conduct what the Pentagon is calling a leadership assessment. But we all know what this really is: a reckoning for institutional failures that have allowed genuine warriors to be tormented by pretenders who've never earned the right to wear the uniform." The room fell silent as Williams placed a classified folder on the conference table. The security markings indicated information classified at levels that required special compartmented access, the kind of secrets that could reshape military careers and potentially trigger congressional investigations. "Operation Ghost Valley," Williams announced, and Chun noticed Staff Sergeant Chun's sharp intake of breath. "How many of you are familiar with this designation?" The silence that followed revealed that none of the assembled officers had sufficient clearance to access information about Kayla's classified service. Williams opened the folder with the precise movements of someone handling explosives, revealing photographs and documents that would change everything they thought they knew about the soldier Kane had been systematically destroying. 3 years ago, a 6-person reconnaissance team operating in eastern Afghanistan encountered what should have been a mission-ending situation. Williams began, her voice taking on the measured tone of someone delivering a briefing. Intelligence failures had placed them in a valley defended by enemy armor, 3 main battle tanks supported by dismounted infantry. She placed the first photograph on the table, an aerial view of mountainous terrain, marked with tactical symbols, showing unit positions and lines of advance. Even to trained military eyes, the tactical situation appeared hopeless. A small team trapped in terrain that offered minimal cover against advancing armor. The team's designated marksman was Specialist Kayla Martinez, Williams continued, placing a second photograph on the table. This image showed a young woman in full combat gear, her face streaked with dust and determination. 23 years old, 5'4", 125 pounds. According to current leadership at this base, too weak to handle military equipment properly. The contrast between the woman in the photograph and Kane's assessment was so stark it would have been comical if the implications weren't so serious. Chun could see the combat veteran's eyes in the image, the kind of focused intensity that came from facing death and choosing to fight rather than surrender. Engagement 1, Williams said, placing tactical diagrams on the table that showed the first tank's approach. Range, 400 meters. Target, T-72 main battle tank advancing on the team's position. Martinez achieved a direct hit with her first Javelin missile, penetrating frontal armor and causing catastrophic vehicle destruction. Major Thompson leaned forward to study the technical specifications of the engagement. As a former armor officer, he understood the precision required to achieve such a hit under combat conditions. The mathematical calculations alone, wind speed, target movement, missile flight time, were complex enough under ideal circumstances. To execute them while under direct fire required capabilities that transcended normal military training. Engagement 2, Williams continued relentlessly. Martinez had sustained significant combat injuries to her left shoulder from incoming shrapnel. Medical reports indicate compound fractures and nerve damage that should have ended her combat effectiveness. Immediately, she fired her second Javelin while bleeding and under machine gun fire from advancing infantry. Another direct hit, second tank destroyed. The medical documentation made for sobering reading. Chun found herself studying X-rays and surgical reports that showed damage extensive enough to warrant immediate medical evacuation. Yet the mission reports indicated that Kayla had continued fighting through injuries that would have incapacitated most soldiers. Engagement 3, Williams said, her voice growing quieter as she approached the climax of the account. Final enemy tank at close range, main gun traversing toward the team's defensive position. Martinez's left arm was barely functional, her weapon system damaged, and conventional engagement techniques impossible due to her injuries. She placed a final photograph on the table, the smoking wreckage of the third tank, its armored hull split open, like a can opener had been applied to it. The violence of the destruction was evident even in the static image, suggesting an explosion of tremendous force that had scattered debris across hundreds of meters of terrain. She improvised, Williams explained. Braced the Javelin system against available terrain, used her functional arm to achieve targeting lock, and fired essentially blind, trusting 3 years of training and muscle memory to guide the missile home. Direct hit at less than 200 meters, a shot that instructor manuals classify as nearly impossible under ideal conditions. The silence that followed Williams's briefing was absolute. Chun could see the assembled officers processing the implications of what they'd just learned. The woman Kane had been systematically humiliating wasn't just a capable soldier, she was a legitimate war hero, whose actions had saved American lives under conditions that would break most people. 6 soldiers extracted alive, Williams concluded. 3 enemy tanks destroyed. 1 American position held against overwhelming odds. And the soldier responsible for this miracle is currently assigned to kitchen duty because her immediate supervisor considers her too weak for real military service. Major Thompson was the first to find his voice. Command Sergeant Major, why was this operation classified? Why isn't Martinez's service record a matter of public knowledge? Williams's expression hardened. Because Operation Ghost Valley involved politically sensitive targets and operational methods that required plausible deniability. The entire mission was buried in black files to protect diplomatic relationships and operational security. Martinez's heroism was classified to protect national interests. She leaned forward, her voice taking on the edge of barely controlled anger. But what we're seeing here isn't about national security, it's about institutional failure. We've allowed a genuine war hero to be tormented by someone whose own service record wouldn't qualify him to carry her equipment. Chun realized the moment had come to reveal Kane's true background. She opened her own folder, containing the results of the investigation into Kane's military career. Command Sergeant Major, we've also been investigating Sergeant Kane's service history. What we found explains his behavior toward Martinez. The documents she placed on the table told the story of a 22-year military career spent entirely in rear echelon positions and training environments. Kane's combat record was non-existent. His closest approach to actual warfare had been a logistics assignment in Kuwait, where he'd never left the secure base perimeter. He's been living a lie, Chun continued. Built his entire career on intimidating people who couldn't expose his lack of real military experience. Martinez represents his worst nightmare, a genuine combat veteran whose presence highlights everything he's never been and never will be. Williams studied Kane's service record with the expression of someone examining a particularly unpleasant specimen. So we have a desk jockey tormenting a war hero because her real experience threatens his manufactured authority. This situation has moved beyond mere harassment. It's become a threat to military readiness and morale. The meeting was interrupted by a knock on the conference room door. A young corporal entered with a message that made Williams smile for the first time since her arrival. Command Sergeant Major, I have a priority communication from the Pentagon. General Morrison requests immediate video conference regarding the Fort Henderson leadership assessment. As the secure video connection was established, Chun realized that the scope of the situation had grown beyond anything she'd initially imagined. What had begun as a routine harassment complaint was about to become a case study in military justice, involving levels of command that could reshape Army policy on how combat veterans were treated within the ranks. The truth about Kayla Martinez was finally going to be revealed, and the consequences would extend far beyond Fort Henderson. Kane's conspiracy of silence was about to be shattered by forces he'd never anticipated and could never hope to control. While Command Sergeant Major Williams was exposing the truth in the conference room, Sergeant Kane was orchestrating what he believed would be his masterpiece, a public demonstration designed to permanently destroy Kayla Martinez's military career and cement his own authority over Alpha Company. What he didn't know was that his every move was being monitored by investigators who were building an airtight case for his removal from service. The trap had been set with meticulous precision. Kane had arranged for a special training exercise to take place during the weekly base inspection, ensuring maximum visibility for what he planned to be Kayla's final humiliation. Pentagon officials, visiting dignitaries, and media representatives would all witness her failure to meet basic military standards, or so Kane believed. The morning air was crisp as soldiers assembled on the main training field, their dress uniforms immaculate in the autumn sunlight. Kane had positioned himself where he could orchestrate events while remaining visible to the distinguished visitors who had come to observe Fort Henderson's training programs. His confidence was absolute. After months of systematic harassment, he was certain that Kayla would crumble under pressure when it mattered most. Private Tommy Johnson found himself assigned to the demonstration team, supposedly selected for his recent completion of Javelin operator training. In reality, Kane had chosen him because Johnson had witnessed Kayla's previous failures and could testify to her incompetence if questions arose later. What Kane didn't know was that Johnson had been quietly documenting the harassment campaign, keeping detailed records of every incident he'd observed. Today's exercise will demonstrate proper anti-tank procedures under simulated combat conditions, Kane announced to the assembled crowd, his voice projecting confidence and authority. We'll be using live training rounds against decommissioned vehicle targets to showcase the capabilities of our personnel. The targets were arranged at various distances across the field hulks of old armored vehicles positioned to simulate a realistic combat scenario. To most observers, it appeared to be a standard military demonstration. But the soldiers of Alpha Company recognized Kane's true agenda. He was setting up conditions where Kayla would be forced to attempt shots that her injured arm couldn't possibly accomplish. Captain Sarah Reynolds, the base's intelligence officer, watched from the VIP viewing area with growing unease. Reynolds had served 3 combat tours and understood Javelin employment better than most officers. The target configuration Kane had arranged was unnecessarily complex, requiring precision and physical capability that would challenge even fully able-bodied operators. "Sergeant Kane," Reynolds called out, her voice carrying across the field. "Could you explain the tactical rationale for this particular target array? It seems unusually demanding for a routine demonstration." Kane's smile never wavered, but those who knew him well could see the flash of irritation in his eyes. "Captain Reynolds, this exercise is designed to showcase realistic combat scenarios. Our soldiers need to be prepared for situations where they can't rely on ideal conditions or textbook positioning." The answer was professionally phrased but rang hollow to anyone with real combat experience. Reynolds made a mental note to discuss her concerns with Colonel Chun after the demonstration. Concluded. Something about Kane's setup felt wrong, too elaborate, too specifically designed to create failure rather than demonstrate capability. As the exercise began, Kane called forward his first operator, Specialist Mark Davidson, a large, athletic soldier whose physical capabilities were beyond question. Davidson approached the Javelin system with confidence, his movements smooth and practiced as he acquired the first target and fired. The missile streaked across the field to impact the distant hull with satisfying precision. "Excellent work, Davidson," Kane announced, his voice carrying clearly to the assembled observers. "This is the standard we expect from properly trained soldiers who understand their responsibilities to the unit." The implied criticism was clear to everyone present. Kane was establishing a baseline of performance that he was certain Kayla couldn't match, setting up the contrast that would justify his previous actions and future recommendations for her removal from service. The second operator was Corporal Jennifer Martinez, no relation to Kayla, whose performance was equally impressive. Kane made sure to emphasize the precision required, the physical demands of the weapon system, and the importance of maintaining standards under pressure. Each successful engagement was presented as evidence of what real soldiers could accomplish when they met military expectations. "For our final demonstration," Kane announced, his voice taking on a tone of false regret, "we have Private First Class Martinez. Despite recent concerns about her capabilities, she has requested the opportunity to demonstrate her proficiency with this weapons system." The lie was delivered with such conviction that most observers accepted it without question. In reality, Kane had specifically ordered Kayla to participate, framing her involvement as a chance to redeem herself after previous failures. The setup was designed to appear voluntary while actually being coercive, a final twist of the knife in his campaign of psychological warfare. Kayla approached the Javelin system with the same quiet composure she'd maintained throughout months of harassment. Her left arm hung at its characteristic angle, the old injury clearly visible to everyone present. But her eyes held something that those who knew her best recognized, the focused intensity of someone preparing for combat. As she knelt beside the weapon system, Kayla's fingers unconsciously touched the piece of shrapnel hanging around her neck. The gesture was so brief that most observers missed it entirely, but it seemed to steady her somehow, connecting her to memories of a time when her capabilities had been measured by results rather than appearances. "Target designated," Kane called out, pointing to the most distant and difficult of the arranged hulks. "Range, 600 meters. Angle of approach requires compensation for terrain elevation. Wind speed 12 knots from the southwest." The target he'd selected was positioned to require the kind of precision shooting that would challenge any operator even under ideal conditions. For someone with Kayla's physical limitations, it should have been impossible. Kane's supporters in the crowd exchanged knowing glances, anticipating the failure that would vindicate months of claims about her inadequacy. But as Kayla settled into position behind the Javelin system, something unexpected happened. Her movements, while accommodating the limitations of her injured arm, displayed a fluidity and precision that spoke of extensive training and real-world experience. She adjusted the weapon's position with subtle corrections that demonstrated an understanding of the system that went far beyond basic operator training. Captain Reynolds leaned forward in the viewing area, her trained eye catching details that others missed. The way Kayla compensated for her arm's limitations, the precise adjustments she made to account for wind and elevation, the confident manner in which she worked through the targeting sequence, all of it suggested capabilities that didn't match Kane's assessment of her abilities. "Something's not right here," Reynolds whispered to the colonel sitting beside her. "That soldier knows what she's doing. Her form isn't textbook, but it's effective. She's compensating for her limitations with technique that suggests significant experience." As Kayla worked through her final targeting checks, Staff Sergeant Lisa Chun appeared at the edge of the viewing area. Accompanied by Master Sergeant Rodriguez and several other senior NCOs, whose presence suggested something more significant than routine observation was taking place. Their positioning allowed them clear sight lines to both the demonstration and Kane's reactions. The targeting sequence was complete. Kayla had achieved weapons lock on the distant target, her improvised positioning allowing her to work around the limitations of her injured arm while maintaining the precision required for accurate engagement. The assembled crowd fell silent as she prepared to fire, the outcome of this single shot carrying implications that extended far beyond routine training assessment. Kane stood nearby, his confidence absolute. He'd positioned the target at maximum effective range, requiring precision that he was certain her damaged arm couldn't deliver. In his mind, her inevitable failure would provide definitive proof of his claims about her incompetence, justifying every action he'd taken against her. What Kane didn't know was that the target he'd selected 600 meters across varied terrain was well within the engagement parameters that Kayla had mastered during Operation Ghost Valley. The distance was actually shorter than her successful engagement against the third enemy tank, and the stationary target presented none of the complexity of hitting a moving vehicle while under direct fire. As her finger moved to the firing mechanism, Kayla thought not of Kane's harassment or the watching crowd, but of the 6 soldiers whose lives had depended on her ability to make impossible shots under impossible conditions. This demonstration, for all of Kane's theatrical staging, was nothing compared to fighting for her life and the lives of her teammates in a dusty Afghan valley. The moment of truth had arrived. In seconds, Kane's carefully constructed narrative would either be validated or destroyed. The truth about Kayla Martinez's capabilities was about to be revealed in the most public and definitive way possible, before an audience that included the very officials who would determine both her future and Kane's fate. The Javelin missile erupted from its launch tube with a thunderous roar that shook the ground beneath the assembled observers. For a split second, time seemed suspended as hundreds of eyes tracked the weapon's trajectory across the Fort Henderson training field. The missile's sophisticated guidance system locked onto its target with mechanical precision, but it was the human precision that had programmed that lock that would determine the outcome of this moment. Kane's smug expression began to falter as he watched the missile's flight path. Something was wrong with his carefully orchestrated humiliation. The weapon was flying true, its trajectory indicating a level of accuracy that shouldn't have been possible given Kayla's supposed limitations. His eyes darted between the missile and the woman who had fired it, confusion replacing confidence as he struggled to understand what he was witnessing. The impact came 6 seconds later with the devastating precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The Javelin missile punched through the target's frontal armor as if it were paper, the shaped charge detonating inside the hull with tremendous violence. The explosion sent a pillar of smoke and debris skyward, the concussion wave rolling across. The fielder reached the viewing area with enough force to rattle windows in nearby buildings. For a moment, the entire assembly stood in stunned silence. Then Captain Reynolds began to applaud, her clapping joined by Master Sergeant Rodriguez, and spreading through the crowd of observers like a contagion of recognition. They had just witnessed something extraordinary, not merely accurate shooting, but shooting that displayed a level of skill that transcended normal military training. Kane's face had gone pale as he stared at the smoking wreckage of the target. At 600 meters, with terrain elevation and crosswind factors to consider, the shot Kayla had just made was technically challenging, even for elite operators. For someone with a weak arm and limited capabilities, it should have been impossible. Yet the evidence was literally smoking before his eyes. "Outstanding marksmanship," declared Colonel Marcus Webb, one of the visiting Pentagon officials. Webb was a decorated combat veteran whose opinion carried significant weight in military circles. That was textbook Javelin employment executed under challenging conditions. Whoever trained that soldier deserves recognition. The irony wasn't lost on those who knew the truth. Kane, who had spent months claiming credit for his unit's training standards, found himself unable to respond to praise for achieving something he'd never believed possible. His carefully constructed narrative was crumbling in real time, and he could only watch helplessly as the foundation of his authority dissolved. But Kayla wasn't finished. As the smoke cleared from her first shot, she began the process of acquiring a second target, something that hadn't been part of Kane's planned demonstration. Her movements were fluid and confident, displaying the kind of muscle memory that came from extensive real-world experience rather than classroom instruction. "Martinez," Kane called out, his voice strained with barely controlled panic. "The demonstration is complete. Stand down and return the equipment to—" "Actually, Sergeant Kane," interrupted Command Sergeant Major Williams, who had arrived from the headquarters building just in time to witness Kayla's first shot. "I'd like to see a follow-up engagement. It's not often we get to observe this level of proficiency, and our visitors might appreciate seeing what our soldiers are truly capable of achieving." Williams' intervention wasn't coincidental. She had timed her arrival perfectly, knowing from her morning briefing exactly when Kane's trap would be sprung. Now she was turning that trap back on its creator, using his own demonstration to reveal truths he'd spent months trying to conceal. The second target was positioned at 400 meters, requiring a different angle of approach and compensation for changed wind conditions. Kane watched with growing horror as Kayla adjusted her position with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this countless times under far more challenging circumstances than a peaceful training field. Private Johnson, observing from his position with the demonstration team, found himself holding his breath as he watched Kayla work. Over the past months, he'd seen her endure humiliation and abuse that would have broken most soldiers. Now he was witnessing something that recontextualized everything he thought he knew about her capabilities and Kane's treatment of her. The second missile launch was even more impressive than the first. Kayla had compensated for the different target parameters with adjustments so subtle that only trained observers could appreciate their significance. The weapon flew with the same devastating accuracy, impacting the second target with enough force to send debris raining down across 100-meter radius. "Jesus Christ," whispered Specialist Davidson, who had fired the demonstration's first shot. "I've been training with javelins for 2 years, and I've never seen shooting like that. How is she doing this?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the destroyed targets. Around the viewing area, military personnel who understood weapon systems were beginning to recognize that they were witnessing something far beyond routine proficiency. This wasn't just good shooting. This was the kind of precision that suggested extensive combat experience and training. that went far beyond what appeared in Kayla's official records. Kane's supporters were beginning to distance themselves from him as the implications of what they'd witnessed began to sink in. Soldiers who had laughed at Kayla's supposed weaknesses now found themselves questioning everything Kane had told them about her capabilities. If he'd been wrong about something this fundamental, what else had he misrepresented? Colonel Chun emerged from the headquarters building, accompanied by the full investigative team that had been reviewing Kane's conduct. Her timing, like Williams, was no coincidence. The public demonstration had provided the perfect opportunity to reveal the truth about Kayla's abilities while simultaneously exposing the fraudulent nature of Kane's authority. "Sergeant Kane," Chun called out, her voice carrying across the field with unmistakable authority. "I need to speak with you immediately. We have some questions about your assessment methods and the accuracy of your personnel evaluations." The formal language was bureaucratic code for something much more serious. Kane understood that his career was about to end, though he still didn't fully comprehend how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. His attempted destruction of Kayla Martinez had instead become the instrument of his own downfall. As Kane was escorted away from the demonstration area, Kayla remained at the firing position, calmly conducting post-firing procedures with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. She seemed almost unaware of the commotion her shooting had caused, focused instead on properly securing the weapon system and ensuring all safety protocols were followed. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached her position, his weathered face showing a mixture of pride and concern. As the communications specialist who had coordinated her extraction from Operation Ghost Valley, he understood better than most what this public revelation meant for her carefully maintained anonymity. "Martinez," he said quietly, ensuring his words wouldn't carry to the dispersing crowd, "are you prepared for what comes next? Once this gets out, your quiet life is over. There will be questions, investigations, probably media attention. You sure you're ready for that?" Kayla's response was delivered with the same calm composure she'd maintained throughout months of harassment. "Master Sergeant, I stopped worrying about my quiet life the day I put on this uniform. If the truth coming out means other soldiers won't have to endure what I've been through, then it's worth whatever comes next." Her words carried the weight of someone who had already sacrificed everything for her duty, and was prepared to sacrifice even more if necessary. The woman Kane had tried to destroy was revealing herself to be someone whose strength had never been diminished by her physical limitations, someone whose true weakness was an inability to let injustice go unanswered. As the crowd dispersed, and the immediate excitement of the demonstration began to fade, the real consequences of what had just occurred were beginning to ripple outward through Fort Henderson's command structure. Phone calls were being made to Washington, reports were being filed, and careers were being evaluated based on how they had responded to the systematic abuse of a genuine war hero. The truth about Kayla Martinez was finally in the open, and there would be no going back to the carefully constructed lies that had allowed her torment to continue. Kane's reign of terror was over, but the broader reckoning with institutional failures that had enabled his abuse was just beginning. The demonstration had lasted less than 20 minutes, but its consequences would reshape Fort Henderson for years to come. And at the center of it all was a woman whose weak arm had just reminded everyone present that true strength couldn't be measured by physical appearance or bureaucratic assessment. It could only be measured by the courage to stand and fight when everything depended on making the impossible shot. 6 months after the demonstration that shattered Marcus Kane's career and exposed the truth about Kayla Martinez, Fort Henderson had become a different place entirely. The institutional changes rippling outward from that October morning had transformed not just how the base operated, but how the entire Army approached the treatment of wounded veterans and the recognition of classified heroism. Kane himself had vanished into the bureaucratic machinery of military justice, his career ending not with ceremony, but with a quiet administrative discharge that stripped him of rank and benefits. The investigation into his conduct had revealed a pattern of abuse so extensive that it triggered reforms in harassment reporting procedures across multiple installations. His name had become a cautionary tale whispered in NCO academies, a reminder of what happened when authority was divorced from competence and compassion. The conference room that had once hosted Kane's humiliation campaigns now served as the headquarters for a new initiative that bore Kayla's unofficial stamp, though her name appeared nowhere in the official documentation. The Silent Warrior program had been established to identify and support service members whose classified backgrounds made them vulnerable to misunderstanding and mistreatment by conventional leadership. Colonel Sarah Chun, now promoted to Brigadier General and reassigned to the Pentagon, had spearheaded the program's development with the kind of bureaucratic precision that could navigate classified security requirements while ensuring genuine heroes received appropriate recognition. The program represented a fundamental shift in how the military handled soldiers, whose service records contained redacted chapters and classified achievements. The problem, Chun explained to a gathering of senior officers from across the Army's command structure, was that we created a system where genuine warriors could be buried in administrative obscurity while pretenders like Kane built careers on intimidating people who couldn't defend themselves. Silent Warrior ensures that classified service doesn't become invisible service. The program's first graduate was Master Sergeant Kayla Martinez, promoted twice in 6 months based on a comprehensive review of her actual service record rather than the sanitized version that had followed her to Fort Henderson. Her new assignment as the lead instructor for the Advanced Anti-Armor Training School represented not just personal vindication, but institutional recognition that expertise earned in combat shouldn't be wasted on kitchen duty and harassment. At the training facility that now bore her unofficial influence, Kayla stood before a class of young soldiers who represented the future of American military precision. The classroom walls displayed photographs from recent conflicts, tactical diagrams showing successful engagements, and equipment specifications for the latest generation of anti-tank weapons. But the most prominent display was a simple placard that read, "Precision under pressure, the Martinez Standard." "The Javelin missile system," Kayla began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had used the weapon to save lives under impossible conditions, "is only as effective as the soldier operating it. Technical specifications can tell you about range and accuracy, but they can't teach you what to do when everything goes wrong and lives depend on making the shot that the manual says is impossible." Her students listened with the kind of attention that came from understanding they were learning from someone whose credentials had been earned in blood and dust rather than classroom exercises. Word of her background had spread through military networks with the speed of lightning, transforming her from an unknown quantity into a legend whose teaching carried the weight of proven experience. Private Jennifer Walsh, a 20-year-old from Colorado who had joined the Army specifically to serve in combat roles, raised her hand with a question that had been troubling her since the course began. "Master Sergeant, how do you maintain accuracy when you're operating with physical limitations? Not everyone has perfect physical capability." It was the kind of question that would have triggered Kane's mockery, but Kayla approached it with the thoughtfulness of someone who understood that strength came in many forms. She rolled up her left sleeve, revealing the network of scars that mapped her forearm permanent, reminders of the shrapnel that had nearly ended her career before it truly began. "Physical limitations don't define capability," she replied, her tone matter-of-fact rather than inspirational. "They define adaptation. The soldier who learns to work around limitations often develops capabilities that those with perfect physical condition never achieve. Innovation comes from necessity, and necessity teaches lessons that can't be found in any manual." She moved to the weapon display, her hand settling on a Javelin system identical to the one she'd used in Operation Ghost Valley, the familiar Weight seemed to center her, connecting her to memories of a dusty valley where adaptation had meant the difference between victory and catastrophe. 3 years ago, I fired 3 missiles under conditions that should have made accurate engagement impossible, she continued. Wounded, under fire, with limited mobility and a damaged weapon system. The shots connected not because of perfect conditions, but because training and determination can overcome almost any obstacle. The classroom fell silent as students absorbed the implications of what they were being told. This wasn't theoretical instruction about overcoming adversity. This was practical guidance from someone who had proven that determination could triumph over seemingly insurmountable challenges. Lieutenant Colonel David Morrison, nephew of General Patricia Morrison, and one of the 6 soldiers whose lives Kayla had saved during Operation Ghost Valley, observed the class from the back of the room. His presence wasn't coincidental. He had specifically requested assignment to Fort Henderson to serve under the woman who had given him a future he'd never expected to see. Morrison understood better than most what Kayla's students were receiving. This wasn't just weapons training, it was mentorship from someone whose judgment under pressure had been tested in ways that most soldiers would never experience. The lessons she taught extended far beyond technical proficiency to encompass the kind of mental resilience that separated survivors from casualties. After the class concluded, Morrison approached Kayla with news that would reshape her future once again. "Master Sergeant," he said, his voice carrying the respect of someone who owed his life to her decision-making, "I've been authorized to extend an invitation from Special Operations Command. They're establishing a new training program for high-risk operations, and they want you to design the curriculum." The offer represented recognition at the highest levels of military command, acknowledgement that Kayla's experience and expertise were too valuable to remain confined to conventional training roles. It was the kind of opportunity that could transform her from a silent hero into an architect of future military capability. Kayla's response was characteristic in its thoughtfulness and humility. "Lieutenant Colonel, I appreciate the recognition, but I need to understand what kind of commitment we're talking about. I've found purpose in teaching soldiers who might face the same challenges I faced. I'm not interested in glory. I'm interested in making sure the next generation is better prepared than mine was." Morrison smiled, recognizing the same selfless dedication that had saved his life in an Afghan valley. "Master Sergeant, the program isn't about glory. It's about taking everything you've learned about adaptation, about precision under pressure, about turning limitations into strengths and building that knowledge into the foundation of how we train our most elite operators." The conversation continued as they walked across the base that had once been the site of Kayla's torment, but had now become the launching pad for her true contribution to military service. Fort Henderson's transformation mirrored her own journey from hidden victim to recognized expert. Proof that institutional change was possible when truth finally overcame conspiracy. As evening approached, Kayla found herself at the base memorial garden, a quiet space dedicated to soldiers who had given their lives in service to their country. Among the commemorative stones was a new addition, a black granite marker bearing 6 names: Rodriguez, Patel, Washington, Chun, Murphy, and Gonzalez. The inscription below reads simply, "Operation Silent Angel Heroes Who Held the Line." She touched the piece of shrapnel hanging around her neck, the metal warm from a day spent teaching young soldiers how to turn obstacles into advantages. The memorial represented something she'd never expected to see: public recognition for teammates whose sacrifice had been buried in classified files for 3 years. A figure approached from behind, and Kayla turned to see Command Sergeant Major Williams, whose investigation had triggered the chain of events that brought justice to Fort Henderson. Williams had become more than a superior officer. She had become a mentor who understood the unique burdens carried by soldiers whose service existed in the shadows of official recognition. "The memorial looks good," Williams said, settling beside Kayla on the bench facing the commemorative stones. Your teammates would be proud to know their sacrifice is finally being acknowledged. Kayla nodded, her eyes fixed on the names etched in granite. They deserved recognition years ago. But maybe this is better. Their legacy isn't just about what they did, but about the changes their story helped create. Other soldiers won't have to endure what I went through, because people finally understand that heroism doesn't always look like what they expect. As darkness settled over Fort Henderson, lights began to illuminate the memorial garden, casting the 6 names in sharp relief against the black stone. The illumination seemed symbolic of a broader truth, that hidden sacrifice, once brought into the light, could inspire changes that extended far beyond individual recognition. Kayla Martinez had begun her journey as a silent hero, whose achievements were buried in classified files. She had endured months of systematic abuse from someone unworthy to carry her equipment. But she had emerged as something more valuable than a decorated veteran. She had become a catalyst for institutional change that would protect future generations of warriors whose service deserved respect rather than mockery. The weak arm that Kane had mocked would continue teaching young soldiers how to turn perceived limitations into tactical advantages. The quiet voice he had tried to silence would continue sharing lessons earned through blood and sacrifice. And the precision that had once destroyed 3 enemy tanks would continue building the capabilities that would keep American soldiers alive in future conflicts. The truth had finally won, and its victory would echo through military training facilities for generations to come. Some legacies are measured in medals and ceremonies. Others are measured in lives saved and lessons learned. Kayla Martinez had achieved something far more lasting than personal vindication. She had transformed her suffering into a foundation for institutional change that would honor her fallen teammates while protecting soldiers who had yet to face their own impossible moments. In the end, the woman they had mocked for weakness had proven stronger than the institution that had failed to protect her. And that strength would continue growing, one student at a time, until no soldier would ever again face the choice between silent endurance and speaking truth to power. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.